At the end of the day, the best way to integrate yourself into a One Health approach is to be an expert in a certain area and be open to learning some extra skill sets with other experts. So transdisciplinary, we work together to try and come up with the best solutions.
Welcome to the Poultry Podcast Show, brought to you by WiseNetics. I'm Doug Corver, dedicated to bringing you the latest insights and discussions in the poultry industry. Get ready to expand your knowledge and stay ahead with today's episode. If you find this interview interesting, please let us know by visiting our website at wisenetics.com. Our guest today for part 2 of our interview is Dr. Jennifer Ronholm. Jennifer is Associate Professor at McGill University. She is the Canada Research Chair of Agricultural Microbiology and also the Director of the One Health Against Pathogens NSERC Create. Welcome to the program, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me.
So a lot of our listeners probably are not familiar with what NSERC is and what Create is. So can you just give us a brief introduction to those programs?
So NSERC is kind of the national funding program that we have here in Canada for science and engineering. So most of the basic science and basic engineering research is funded through NSERC. And a couple of years ago, they came out with this really interesting program where they'll fund a training grant. So the grant's not for basic research or specific reagents or things normally associated with a lab, but it's actually to pay students to get additional skill sets outside of research. So we'll have a PhD or a master's student, we'll give them some little extra money, and they'll learn things like public communication or policy creation, which is what our Create does. And it helps these young budding scientists learn to communicate better to the public and learn about public policy so they can help the government create good policy.
Oh, that sounds like a great program.
I'm very proud of it, and I hope it leads to some good students in a couple of years.
As director of the One Health Against Pathogens program, maybe you can tell us about One Health in general. What is One Health?
To make it really simple, I always say if the cows and chickens are healthier, the people will be healthier. But if we break that down a little, it kind of describes this concept of really intimately connected human health, environmental health, and animal health. So if we have an infection that's spreading widely through humans, it will negatively affect animal health. And we've seen that. With the recent COVID pandemic, there was obviously a virus that went through the entire human population. And we saw it infecting animals that would have never seen a virus like that. Mice, deer, beavers, gorillas. And you see the same thing happening with animals when there's a high prevalence of something like polio or Ebola in a primate population, you'll see it break out in the human as well. So the idea is that we can find the optimal intervention point. Like maybe it's not all about treating humans through vaccines. Maybe there's a better way to treat the mice or to treat the chimpanzees to make everyone healthier.
Poultry Star from DSM Firmenich is a poultry-specific product that combines the benefits of probiotics and prebiotics to enhance gut health. The probiotic strains in Poultry Star are isolated from healthy birds, not soil, ensuring excellent adaptability. The prebiotics support the growth of beneficial bacteria, creating a balanced gut environment. Poultry Star is ideal for use during key stress periods, after antibiotic treatments, and when transitioning between feeds. With over 20 years on the market, it's a proven way to boost your bird's health and performance. Learn more at dsm-firmenich.com/poultrystar.
It sounds like it involves a lot of different skill sets and areas of expertise and fields of study. How do you integrate all of that together?
Absolutely. That is the challenge with One Health. So I think at the end of the day, the best way to integrate yourself into a One Health approach is to be an expert in a certain area and be open to learning some extra skill sets with other experts. So transdisciplinary, we work together to try and come up with the best solutions. Beyond that, I think to really make this holistic approach to health, you also have to have the ability to understand sectors outside of science, like the communication, like the policy making, and even to a certain extent, equity. And I think you see that with health around the world as well. Vaccine sharing would be an excellent way to prevent future outbreaks of many diseases. So coming up with those skill sets as well. It is difficult, but I think it's ultimately be an expert, a really good expert in your own area, and be open to learning a couple extra skills along the way.
Mm-hmm. So, we go to grad school and usually we're trained in very specific, a specific field, even sometimes, a specific set of techniques. And so does it involve a change of mindset then for existing researchers, maybe old researchers, and a way of training new researchers?
Yeah, possibly. I think you still have to be an expert in those three techniques because a lot of times those three techniques take years to master. But understanding that those three techniques, maybe you don't only talk to the other people who use those three techniques. Maybe you can integrate them with some other people. So just being open to the collaboration and transdisciplinary research.
Let's say you've got a team of experts. Can you give some examples of what kind of expertise would be part of a One Health approach, just in general, or maybe if it helps, if you've got a specific example of how different experts have come together to have a benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a really nice example with Lyme disease recently. So we know that Lyme disease is, encroaching on Canada. It's a bacterial infection that we get when we're bit by a tick that's infected. So the approach, in the past has always been come up with a vaccine for humans, vaccinate people, and then it doesn't matter if they get bit by ticks. But there were some problems with the vaccine. There was a vaccine in the early 90s. It didn't make enough money to keep itself going for a whole host of reasons. So there's no vaccine right now. But ticks can't get Lyme disease unless they feed on an infected mouse. So if you could get Lyme disease out of the mouse population, you wouldn't have to worry about getting Lyme disease to the human population. So, wildlife biologists who study mice and tick biologists who study ticks and vaccinologists have all worked together to come up with this strategy where we can vaccinate the mice against Lyme to keep the Lyme disease from getting out of getting into the humans. This product, the mouse Lyme disease vaccine, was, put in some pellets that the wildlife researchers helped come up with, and they kind of sprinkle it in yards and along trails, and it's now licensed in several states, and it really drops the Lyme disease prevalence in the ticks in the areas where the mice are vaccinated. So ultimately, this will result in increases in mouse health and human health. So it's a very One Health approach to Lyme disease.
You mentioned the human vaccine didn't make money. So in implementing a One Health approach, how much can you depend on market forces? How much is dependent on government policy and even governments working together in different countries?
I think all of the above is critical. I think policies have to be enacted to support health and to support these One Health initiatives. That's critical. I think, it's complex why the first Lyme disease vaccine didn't make money. And I think public communication and public understanding of vaccination is a huge component there. So beyond just good policies, I think we also need public outreach, public communication, and a public who, understands some of the science and enough to understand why certain policies are being implemented and why certain approaches are being taken.
You mentioned public uptake. Is that a bit of a challenge these days with maybe science skepticism becoming more of an issue?
Yeah, I think there's some evidence that science skepticism is higher than it used to be, possibly at an all-time high. And I think there's a lot of reasons to feed into that. But I think learning to communicate effectively to the public for scientists and even creating projects that involve the public and creating scientists of the future who are very much engaged in the public is the way to approach this. We definitely need to build back a better relationship with the public. I think some trust was lost during the last pandemic, but I think it's a great place to start rebuilding.
Can you give some examples of how you're looking at the poultry industry with a One Health view?
So I think the antibiotic story is a big story. If we can reduce antibiotic use in the poultry industry and create better products, that would be great. But in addition to that, we know that there's a lot of wild poultry ancestors. There's the wild red jungle fowl in Asia. There's turkeys in Canada. And I think, looking at these as a reservoir for poultry health or a reservoir for future probiotics is a great way to, continue building some of the maybe lost microbiome of our poultry industry. So looking at that environmental wild poultry perspective and pulling that into our industry is where I'm looking for the future.
If you're enjoying this episode of the Poultry Podcast Show presented by WiseNetics, please remember to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends and family. You can also set notifications to on from our channel so you don't miss any other upcoming episodes. And as always, please feel free to leave your comments. Your feedback is valuable to us. So, looking at a One Health approach to Canada, what's been the uptake in the poultry industry here implementing these principles?
I'm not 100% sure on how many poultry producers are looking at the industry from a One Health approach. But I think that leads into what's happening now with the avian influenza. We do see it moving into Canada slowly, and I think we'll continue to see avian influenza move in. I'm hopeful we won't, but I have a feeling that we will over the next couple of years. And I think that really demonstrates why One Health is so important to the poultry industry and to the other industries, is that this is a wildlife disease that's spilling over into industry and will eventually spill over into the human population, even though I'm hopeful it won't. So I think looking at this of the One Health perspective, like if we can make the wild birds healthier and if we can cut that line where it transfers into the industrial birds.
Yeah, and there's probably a good, a vivid example in terms of transmission into the commercial dairy herd in the United States. So that maybe underscores the importance of not just looking at solving the end problem, but where can we intervene at places before that.
Absolutely. And I think if we could actually develop vaccines that, maybe we can release into the wild to help the wild bird population suppress the infection, or if we could develop vaccines at the level of commercial poultry, these would all help. At minimum, developing vaccines for producers so that the producers are protected and it doesn't spill over into the general pop is another great way to intervene somewhere along this line of transmission.
If you look around the world, are there examples of countries or industries that have really done a good job of taking the One Health approach? I guess one of the examples that I was thinking of is the elimination of screwworm from the United States and progressively working down towards Darien Gap in Panama.
I don't know this story, but it sounds like a good one.
Yeah, so screwworm has largely been eliminated in basically Central America north by releasing sterile male the flies, so that when they mate, the eggs are infertile, and it's been pushed back. Basically back to the Darien Gap in Panama, which they're not able to cross. Now, changes in policy have meant that program is perhaps not as effective as it used to be. But are there other examples, I guess, in the poultry industry or in other with other diseases that you've seen in various places in the world? I
mean, there's a lot of great examples in wild animals. And I think the Ontario program for rabies eradication by dropping rabies bait and pushing Rabies out of Ontario is a great example. And, it still runs along the border with the States. Sometimes something slips by, but it's suppressed. I think that's a wonderful example of a One Health approach to controlling an infectious disease. In terms of an industry-specific example, I think there's a lot of smaller examples, but I think I'm still waiting for a huge shining example of a One Health approach being applied to cattle, chickens, or pigs.
Okay. So in a perfect world, what would success look like in achieving a One Health approach? So maybe, where would it start and what would be the ultimate outcome?
I think it's ultimately disease specific in terms of, suppressing a disease using an approach that is good for the environment, is good for the animals, and is good for humans. And I think the target is constantly changing because we'll constantly see new diseases, take the place of old diseases. It's one of these wicked problems where the solutions, are kind of just beyond our grasp, but it's always just playing whack-a-mole with infections. So I'm not sure what a perfect solution looks like, but I guess the answer is better than it looks now.
So on your team, what kinds of expertise do you have?
On my team, we're pretty hardcore microbiologists. So we have, level 2, level 3 skill sets in the lab for culture-based stuff. We work a lot with the microbiome. So a lot of DNA processing, RNA, DNA extraction, and sequencing. And most of the people on my team have a pretty good bioinformatics understanding to deal with the large data that comes from the nucleic acid extraction and sequencing.
So moving out from your group, then, who are the people you collaborate with? You mentioned how collaboration was important.
Yeah. So at this moment in time, I'm collaborating with a lovely scientist in Singapore who works on wild red junglefowl, and we're trying to take some of their microbiome and make it usable for poultry. I have a couple of collaborators in Norway who work on dairy farms, and we're trying to learn from them and see how mastitis can be controlled so well in Norway, and can we export some of that technology into the Canadian context. And then we have collaborators across Canada, just who have access to different types of farming operations and can provide excellent samples just to see what works and what doesn't in different areas.
I'm really interested in the wild junglefowl. How different is the microbiome in those birds?
Yeah, I don't think we know. No one has been able to do an intensive study of these birds for their microbiome in either a culture-dependent or culture-independent way. There's different populations throughout Asia, so it'll probably be different in different areas. But I'm learning how difficult it is to sample these birds, collect the sample, and I think sample return to Canada will essentially be impossible because of regulations. So it's not technically difficult work, it's logistically and paperwork difficult work.
How about, you said you had samples of chickens from across Canada. How different were those microbiomes?
Yeah, each chicken had a very different microbiome. That was part of our study design. We wanted to capture as much diversity as possible. One of the chickens we used was one that lives at my house and just roams around the yard, and its microbiome was completely different than any of the inside industrially produced chickens. So it's, I think it has a lot to do with environment and feed.
Are there genetic differences as well, do you think? So different strains of chickens or different laying hens versus broilers have a gut that tends to favor certain bacteria or tends to discriminate against certain bacteria?
Yeah, different types of birds will have a very different microbiome. But even for that particular study, we just looked at leghorns, and even the leghorns had a very different microbiome from bird to bird to bird.
So it sounds like the students in your lab are exposed to not just an expertise in microbiology, but other fields as well with your collaborators. What's the prospect for grad students coming out of a lab like yours for finding work in the agricultural sector? Yeah,
my students have taken, the ones who have gone on have taken interesting paths. A few work in the food industry. Some work for one of my PhD students that just left works for a bioinformatics company. She uses her skill sets in that way. But I think what they gain is, the ability to learn new things very rapidly and the openness to do so. And I hope they're also leaving with excellent communication skill sets.
All right. Well, thanks for that really interesting walk through One Health. I think it sounds like there's a lot of opportunities, and we all interact with our environment, and we're all impacted by things that happen outside of our own little zone of occupation, I guess. So thanks a lot for that.
It's time for our famous three.
A worldwide leader in animal nutrition, Adiceo's portfolio of products includes methionine, the full range of vitamins, enzymes, organic selenium, probiotics, mycotoxin management strategies, and palatability products. With such a diverse offering, Adiceo supports its customers with a broad range of expertise, tools, and services to help them maintain a competitive advantage. Adiceo, fueling predictable profits. To learn more, visit Adiceo at www.adiceo.com.
Before we go, I've got a few closing questions for you. Do you have a favorite work-related book or resource that is your go-to?
I do, actually. A recent book that just came out, The Human Disease, is about a One Health approach to human infections, but it goes through a lot of human successes and human failures in dealing with One Health. And that's by Sabrina Schultz, who works at the Smithsonian Institute.
Sounds interesting.
It is. I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in One Health. It's a very good introduction.
How about outside of your profession? Do you have a favorite book or resource?
I really like Swedish crime novels. I think I started with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which is probably my favorite, and then just kept going from there. They're really good at writing crime novels.
And then finally, in your experience, what do you think is necessary for a trainee to be successful in your field?
It's going to sound like the most ancient answer ever, but hard work. And I think with the introduction of AI, AI can produce all this information and tell you almost anything immediately, but it can't go and get stuff done. So just that ability to take a smart idea and then execute it, I think that's the number one skill set they can leave with, the ability to get something done.
Yeah, that's great advice. Well, thanks very much for joining us today, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me.
That concludes another episode of the Poultry Podcast Show presented by Wisenetics. Thanks for joining us for today for part 2 of our interview with Dr. Jennifer Ronholm from McGill University. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay updated for future episodes. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback is invaluable to us. Visit our website at wisenetics.com and learn more about all our podcast segments for poultry, swine, dairy, beef, feed mill crops, and even pet food. I'm Doug Corver, and I'll see you next time on the Poultry Podcast Show.